John is joining us from the west coast of the United States. It's 11:30 in the evening where he is. This will finish at 1 a.m. for him. So thank you for your commitment to joining us at this time. John is the Regional Managing Director for Duke Corporate Education. He's based in the United States and he oversees North America and Southeast Asia. He basically works with clients across a wide range of sectors in designing and developing and delivering leadership solutions to help their organizations prepare for growth, opportunities, and challenges. John has an award-winning career in both academia and business. He has worked with some of the world's top universities and led global marketing for organizations including Nike, Infomix, and Transamerica. Plus, he has started 2 award-winning companies. He is also a best-selling author who has published 10 books on marketing and business. He's on Strong Demand. His analysis has been featured on the BBC, CNBC, MSNBC, Channel News Asia, Bloomberg, ESPN, and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and the New York Times. John speaks widely at global conferences, including TEDx Shanghai, the Human Capital Leadership Institute Summit, the American Marketing Association, the Brand Finance Annual Forum, EduTech, and the World Knowledge Forum. So he's in strong demand. For you that don't know Duke Corporate Education, I'm sure you have if you've had corporate education before. It has been ranked by the Financial Times among the top 3 worldwide in custom executive education globally for 19 consecutive years. I understand that Duke Corporate Education is the #1 provider in America, ranked by Financial Times. So thank you for joining us, John. There you go. That's the short introduction. I had a much longer profile. But John, tell us a little bit about what you want to talk about today with our executives here in Vietnam.
Oh, great. Well, thanks, Victor. And by the way, hello to everybody. So I'm really thrilled to be here for this. And in this nonstop COVID world in which everything seems to be in environments like this, it's kind of fun to be able to do this. I was hoping to have a conversation with all of you about what are some of the key attributes we're seeing and requirements we're seeing for CEOs. It's based on the work that we're doing around the world and some of the research I've done over the years as well. We work actively with companies across 80 different countries. And as you probably heard in some of the preamble coming up to this too, I spent a long time in Southeast Asia, so all across the region. And so a lot of the insights are coming out from those conversations and from interviews with CEOs. So we'd love to share that with you.
Excellent. So, the topic today is the key requirements for today's CEOs. If you want to know what it is you need to grow in, this is probably the session to join. What are the sources for your research, John?
Okay, good question. So a number of things. So let me go to the sort of the back part of this first. For the last 20 years or so, since I've been in sort of the academic side or the consulting side of my career, which really kind of kicked off in a big way in Singapore when we first moved there. I've spent a long time reviewing different companies around the world. And part of the research that my MBA students would do and that we ended up doing with different organizations was to look at the top 500 to 600 companies around the world and their comparison companies in their sector to see what made them top performing organizations. And top performing wasn't just financial performance, but it was also around how they contributed to society and what the leadership was like and what their valuations were like in terms of brand value and things like that. So that led to a book called Competitive Success that showed the findings of that and what the practices are of those firms. And that also broke down even some of the initial practices of the behaviors of top performers. So that's one part of the research. Another part of the research is related to publication that Yusuf knows well, my colleague who's on this, called Dialogue Review. And Dialogue Review is Duke CE's journal. It's a bit like Harvard Business Review meets Fast Company magazine. It's a quarterly journal, and it's been around now for about 8 years. And we take it from our various educators. We have 1,500 educators around the world that we work with, and our own internal research as well. And we're always looking at leadership related issues because that's our expertise as an organization. And so some of the research is coming out from that. And then another part of it is something you may be familiar with, as Victor mentioned. Anne Valerie, who is one of our colleagues, Yusuf's and my colleague from Singapore, came out and spoke to your organization a year and a half ago or so about some research we had started at that point called SHIFT. And I think, Victor, you may have sent out the white paper on it again as a refresher for folks. And if not, we can make sure that you get it. But I can update a bit about what's going on with SHIFT as well, because that's actually been instrumental in driving much of what we've seen now in leadership change. And in fact, really has escalated because of what's happened with COVID and here in North America, racial injustice and a variety of other things that are creating some real challenges for organizations.
Okay, thank you, John. So I think we've all received the paper. We were sent out this morning, but I wanted to ask, why should CEOs, general managers, country heads here in Vietnam be focusing on the key requirements for the work they do? What is your argument for that, John?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So part of it is, if any of you are like I am, when I grew up, I envisioned what CEOs did as sort of this exalted role, high atop a pedestal in an organization. They commanded their forces, if you will, and they made things happen, and companies grew, and there was this sort of this wonderful perspective that I had on what I thought that they represented. And it turns out that the job, as many of you obviously know since you're CEOs, is a lot more nuanced and complex than that. And it's not just the symbolic value, the representational value of being the senior level person in the organization. There is another component to it that is actually kind of critical, and that gets to the management of what's called value creation. And value creation isn't just the financial aspect to it, although that's obviously important. Value creation also deals with what are those dimensions of value overall, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, because there's 4 different dimensions that we'll get into. But what was most interesting in the last few years, and really talking to a lot of your colleagues and counterparts in different parts of the world, was to recognize that there's some really fundamental questions that CEOs everywhere are dealing with. There's 5 fundamental questions. And one of them is just about values. You know, what do we fundamentally care about? Now that may sound self-evident, and it may be just straight between the eyes, 2x4 between the eyes, obvious. But those values about what we care about have a great deal to do with how our organizations decide to show up in the world. So values is one of the questions. Another one is purpose. You know, why do we uniquely exist? And that's not an existential question or on navel gazing. It's much more around what is the purpose of the business beyond making money? Because indeed, if your definition of what you do is to make money, you could do that doing anything. But then you realize you're aligning resources, you're hiring talent, you're doing things to achieve a certain objective. That objective is often in terms of a much longer term horizon than maybe even your shareholders realize. And that has to do with why you're uniquely there, what's your contributing differentiator for the world. The third question is vision. And that has to deal with more about what does success look like for the organization X number of years into the future. You define X number of years. Obviously, the farther out it goes, the more challenging it gets. But it's more around what's success going to look like if we achieve this. And in the terms of the work that we do at Duke CE, when organizations bring us in and we start working with leadership teams, we often look at very short time horizons, the next 2 to 3 years, because we know there's very specific objectives they want to try to solve. And it gets more and more abstract the farther out you go. The fourth question is around strategy, and that is, you know, what choices do we need to make in order to get to that vision? And then the fifth question deals with actions. How must we behave, right? So again, it's values. Why do we fundamentally, what do we care about? Purpose, why do we exist? Vision, what does success look like for us X number of years in the future? Strategy, what are the choices we have to make to get there? And then actions, how do we behave? And the behavior part of it is something we'll get to in a little bit, but it's really important because in that role, we find that some of the most successful folks don't realize how successful they are because of the way they show up, as opposed to the outcomes of the things that the company does in terms of financial results. They don't realize that their actual demeanor has something to do with this, but it's more than demeanor too, which we'll get into.
Thank you, John. By the way, in a moment you'll have an opportunity to ask your own questions with John directly. But before we do that, I just wanted to ask you a couple more questions. And one of them is when it comes to value creation, John, where should CEOs, country managers be focusing their efforts when it comes to value creation, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I love this, and it's fascinating to me because many of you, I'm sure, went to business school, and certainly when I was in business school myself, or when I was a professor, I fell into the same sort of pattern that we all fall into when you get a business education, and that is that at the end of the day, a business has to make money. We know that, right? There's no question that the revenues matter, the costs matter, the profitability matters. But it turns out that there's actually 4 different domains of value. And this goes back to what I was mentioning a few minutes ago that are driving what becomes the financial outcomes of the organization. The first and foremost, first among equals is reputational value. And reputational value is trust. Do you trust the organization you're doing business with? And it may sound self-evident, but it's surprising how many organizations actually violate that. And they don't do it intentionally and mischievously, but they don't necessarily follow through in the promises that they make. The delivery is off. And then actually every time that happens, it puts a dent in the organization. And so trust, reputational value is the first value. The second one is organizational value. And organizational value is internal to the company itself. And organizational value is, do your people feel like they are contributing to something substantial, that their work matters, that what the organization is doing is akin to a cause. And that's not meant to sound hyperbolic. It's not meant to sound existentially philosophical. It is to say, back to that notion of purpose, if people feel like their work matters beyond just showing up on the day and getting a wage paid, then they will be more likely to contribute what they call discretionary effort, which is the ability to just and desire to do things above and beyond sort of the minimum. So it's reputational value, which is trust. It's organizational value, which is a sense of cause for people inside. The third area is societal value. And societal value is about the external lens that society places on any organization. And that is your organization engaged in the communities it serves above and beyond selling products and services? Because all of our organizations sell something. Question is in the markets where we are we doing something above and beyond that? Are we actually a part of the fabric of society in that local community? It could be things like local volunteer efforts. Do we give our own employees freedom to choose what their causes are that they'd like to be involved with? But every one of those is a mechanism to contribute and connect to that local community above and beyond just having an office there. You do those 3 well, reputational value, organizational value, societal value, then the byproduct is what we've all assumed business to be, which is financial value. And that's the health of the organization. And that's not me saying that. That actually is nearly 1,000 different organizations worldwide, and the way they start to look at how they line up their various assets and resources in support of what their objectives are as a business. So, Victor, you asked a simple question, and I gave you a really long answer.
That's fine. And they'll have an opportunity to ask.
Uh-oh, I lost your volume.
Okay, somebody suggested I put it on mute when you were speaking, and I did. I forgot to put it back on. There you go. No, that was a great. Please feel free to share your knowledge. So I wanted to ask one more question before I'll open it up to the executives and the business leaders in Vietnam to ask you questions directly. But you've recently done research. I understand it was done this year. You interviewed CEOs, organizational leaders from not just Asia, but around the world. And you tried to, the research was to identify the leadership capabilities they believed they should have to succeed in this chaotic time. What did your research reveal, John?
This is the genesis for Shift itself. And it was fascinating because we approached it from a very simple question, which was, because periodically every few years, Duke CE does CEO level research. And we want to find out what the sort of the pulse is of the CEO community around the world. And oftentimes we've gone off in different directions about things related to growth of the enterprise and whatnot. But this time we approach it from the standpoint of, it felt like the world was dealing with a fair amount of built up, pent up anxiety. And we wanted a sense of, if if you had to ask the average CEO, what is it that's keeping you awake at night? We wanted to have some really penetrating conversations with them about that. And we left it almost open to that question. I mean, there was half a dozen other questions tied to that, but that often elicited about an hour, hour and a half of conversation, because it was pretty interesting to hear what they said were the things that were making them basically sleepless. And those things amounted to what came out in the Shift white paper that many of you may have already seen and have since been expanded upon. But what was intriguing was the way they framed it. When I say they, and I'm making it sound awfully like all of them said that, but it was about 90%. Okay, so that was powerful. It's over 100 different CEOs and then equivalent leaders around the world. And they said, look, one of our anxieties is that with the change that's taking place around the world, whether it's political change, whether it's, and this is pre-pandemic when we first started the research, it's climate change, you name it. We realize that we have too much information coming in and not enough time to make decisions. We have to be faster about how we make those decisions. We cannot wait for perfect analysis because it leads to paralysis. And I'm sure you've heard of the analysis paralysis. We simply have to be faster. So speed became the first dimension of concern that they believe the next generation of leaders right below them and below that need to start building. They need to be faster. The second one is human centricity. And human centricity, it was really interesting because in a couple of cases, CEOs basically said, we feel like we failed our organizations, even though they were successful. And I asked them why, and they said, we feel like we failed our organizations because we've sort of lost the human connection. In our drive to meet our quarterly numbers, if they were publicly traded, in our drive to make sure that we hit certain market share objectives, in our drive to hit KPIs, we sort of set aside the importance of talent development and not just putting people into training sessions every year, but actually nurturing meaningful coaching, mentoring relationships and conversations that built the next generation of leaders. So we sort of neglected that, and we realized that it wasn't just an internal problem. We'd also removed ourselves so much from understanding the marketplace that we'd made a lot of false assumptions about our stakeholders, including our customers. And we would just start building things because we were good at building things, and we weren't necessarily good at understanding what people actually needed on that side of the equation. So human centricity was the second component. The third component to that was imagination. And that, as you can well imagine, deals with how clever can you be, how imaginative, how innovative, how creative can you be in fashioning some sort of a solution to a problem, to a need out there. And one of the reasons why they felt it was a shortcoming was partly because of a sort of a culturally, a cultural sticking point about the definition of innovation and creativity. And that is, in many of our organizations, and this is not just a North American or even Asian phenomenon, it's worldwide, they often look at imagination and creativity as sort of something that artists do. You put them in a corner of the building, kind of away from others because they interfere. They're sort of the outliers, or they're the freaky, weird people. And that indeed is not the case. It turns out that imagination is best cultivated when you provide an environment of psychological safety, as we call it, where people feel like they can take risks. And that's where some of the best ideas come out of. And by the way, imagination also does not require deep budgets. It just requires an imagination to be able to say, how do we combine resources in novel ways? The fourth area is flexibility. And that really comes down to a simple recognition that in all of our careers, or certainly many of our careers, and the CEOs echoed this time and time again, they built tremendous domain expertise. And many of you may have heard of something called the T-shaped leader. So we work a lot on this framing of the T-shaped leader. The vertical part of the T is what we started our careers as. We came out of wherever it was, engineering, you name it. We're accountants, we're marketers, but we built this capability and capacity to be experts in an area. As we moved up in our careers, we began to take on more responsibility for managing others and projects and outside stakeholders. And suddenly our lens shifted from our expertise and our skill set in that area toward being able to oversee and supervise others. And when that happened, you realize that people couldn't shift easily because they were outside their comfort zone. And when they're outside their comfort zone, it was very difficult to get them into roles where they could actually be effective leaders. So it has to begin earlier. So flexibility is key. And then the final piece, which goes back to something I mentioned, one of the domain values, is trust. And I mentioned it earlier, but the absence of trust means basically nothing else matters. And engendering trust, as obvious as it sounds, you know it when it's absent, right? You know it in a relationship you might have with a colleague or with a friend or whatever it might be. And you know how hard it is to win back trust if it's ever been lost. And so all of those factors became the resonant points that the CEOs mentioned as the capabilities they believe the next generation leaders must have. And they themselves said to a person, look, we have really struggled in each of these areas. It doesn't mean our businesses are failures and we're terrible humans. It does mean we realize that the nature of leadership today is vastly more complex than it ever was before. And it requires these capabilities to help people do things better, differently, and more effectively than ever. So to your point, Victor, too, what's been interesting is because of the pandemic, this has put each of the lenses of shift, each of those 5 lenses of shift under the real microscope, because you're beginning to realize we're all facing the question of how can we do things faster and differently because organizations are dealing with circumstances and conditions we could never change. I mean, we couldn't face before. We have to do things much more imaginatively than we ever did. We actually have much more of a human connection possibly than we ever did because of this environment. Yusuf will know this, but in our conversations at Duke CE, which we have weekly globally, we talk to each other more now than we ever did when we were face to face. Point is that the pandemic has really accelerated each of those capability areas.
Thank you, John. For those of you that have joined a little bit later, John has joined us from the west coast of the United States. It's nearly midnight, I think, over there. I'd like to open it up now, bearing in mind that John has trained enormous amounts of groups of leaders, mostly in Southeast Asia, but also North America as well. He was based in Singapore for 15 years. He's been to Vietnam a number of times and trained executive groups of leaders. Who would like to go ahead and ask John a question right now? And if you have a question that you want to just type whilst he's speaking, feel free to do that as well. We'll try and get as many questions answered as possible. And by the way, thank you for the person that's organizing the technology here, that now John's the main screen and not me. I think that you saw me as the main screen. So go ahead, who'd like to ask John a question?
Hello, can I go first?
Bob, is that Bob?
That's Bob, yes.
Go ahead, Bob. Ask your question.
How you doing, Sean?
I'm doing well, Bob. How are you?
So good I can't stand it. I've been, just the last 3 weeks, I have been teaching a leadership organization behavior MBA class for University of Hawaii. They have an executive MBA program, and I'm teaching two cohorts here at Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi. So it's been a blast. And your white paper is exactly what I'm talking about in class. So my question is, can I share this with my MBA students?
Of course.
Okay, that's great.
Absolutely.
And are you, the next question is, are you doing any type of leadership studies here in Vietnam in the coming year or so? I'd love to participate. My doctorate happens to be in leadership, so it's all up my alley. So.
Hey, cool. So the answer to your question is sort of. When you put the time boundary of the next year or so, that's the only uncertainty, and that's just because of the COVID circumstances. But if we can get a chance to, because first off, I believe this kind of research is, you know this better than anybody, but it's best when we can conduct it face-to-face, because we can get to be in the environment and see what the people are like. With that said, if it turns out that COVID is going to be extended, and as you know, here in the US, we seem to be finding ways to make it worse. It turns out if it's going to last for a long time, then we will probably have to engage differently through this kind of mechanism, and that Bob will absolutely reach out to you. That'd be really cool.
Good. I'd love it. So thank you very much.
Yeah, hey, and good luck with that. How do you like the students there? Is it good?
Yeah, it's good. I've been teaching MBA classes for 15 years here. but it used to be more finance classes, and now it's leadership, organization, behavior. So it's, but it's a joy. It really is. The students are so hungry for it, and the one thing is, yeah, this whole idea of empowering others and delegating is so foreign to them, and it takes such a culture change within an organization that they say, yeah, we hear you, but we can't do it. So.
Yeah, well, and if I could comment on that too, because I think it's interesting, and it's not just for what you and I do when we're working with students, but also when you think about what's happened over the last 25, 30 years in business education more broadly. Most of our organizations around the world are populated by people like all of us who've gone through a classic business education. And that classic business education was pretty weak on soft skills. No matter where you went, whether it was Harvard or Mississippi State or you name it. And that's not to anybody's fault, other than that was sort of the nature of the discipline, because in the 1950s, as business schools were developing, part of what was happening was they were competing against the sciences and the hard sciences for validity in the academic world. And so they started to develop a much more scientific approach to business that put them into peer-reviewed journals and the rest of it. And the end result is business became this really rigorous science-based hard skill, which was great. We've got a lot of fantastic analysts around the world, but a lot of people who just can't work with others to save their lives. And that's one of the challenges is business schools, I think, have an obligation to actually make a big pivot, recognizing that the soft skills are really the hard stuff. Not an original quote there, but that's an important point. And our organizations have an obligation to continue to nurture that, because at the end of the day, it's all about us. It's about people and the people we work with, and if they're turned on, that'll make a big difference in a organization that's going to succeed.
Thank you for your question. Sorry,
totally
Bob.
agree. Thank you very much. I don't want to hog up all of the questions and stuff, but I work with AmCham's education committee here, and soft skills is one of the topics that we're trying to figure out how can help. So I'll get in touch with you more.
Please.
Thank you. Thank you. So Shub's the General Director of DHL Express here in Vietnam. You had a question, Shub. You typed it in the chat, but would you like to ask John directly the question, Shub?
Yeah, thanks. I'm not sure about the sound quality though, so that's why I typed it in. I do have some network issues here. So I hope, John, you can hear me clearly.
I can hear you fine.
Okay, all right. So John, my question was really about the impact of culture. I think you will see a similar comment from Anup on the chat as well, because it seems like sometimes in Vietnam, maybe we're not exactly a global culture here yet, but I want to hear your thoughts about the impact of culture on leadership style. And do you believe that there is a common leadership style that actually works globally?
Oh, well, the latter part I can answer pretty quickly and say no, but I can explain why that is. But the bigger question on culture is a fascinating one, and Bob, you probably see this too, and Julep, I think you'll probably see this in your organizations. And culture kind of gets defined in a lot of different ways, right? I mean, there's some classic academic frameworks, Hofstede's cultural framework and whatnot, that you use to help sort of map down different populations. I tend to look at it in sort of a simpler fashion, which is there are country-specific cultures, which I think is the genesis of your question. But then there are also corporate cultures as well. And in fact, I'm working on a new book right now about the nature of what organizations need to do differently to cultivate corporate cultures that create kind of the right motivations to do better in the world, where people feel switched on to do that. And that's partly because the nature of culture is actually very powerful. Culture in a company is not much different than culture in a country, in that it's the social fabric. Company is just another social organism, right, in the world. And if our people feel like they're part of a special corporate culture, that can actually have a tremendously positive effect on their ability to contribute in that discretionary effort way that I talked about earlier. Now, it's interesting about country culture too, and I know I'm preaching to the converted to all of you there. I remember when working across Southeast Asia, and in particular, was always going into Vietnam and going into Thailand and going into Malaysia. three very close together, geographically proximate countries that are very different culturally. And the way we had to deal with the populations there had to be sensitive too. And it wasn't sensitivity specific to, I mean, it could be religion, but it was more around what are the mores and cultural antecedents that people bring into their lives that they've been brought up with, that make it very difficult to say that they should be like others in other countries, which goes to your other question. You know, is there sort of a universal leadership approach? And the short answer to that is no, there really isn't. What is important is recognizing that there's going to be something around this idea of flexibility we talked about in the shift research, which is being able to read audiences and understand what's culturally relevant, and being very painfully aware of where you might culturally step in things that could be very uncomfortable if you're not aware of that. So culture plays a big role in that context. I will say one other thing to answer your question too is part of some of the research that I did, and this goes back a little over a decade, led to individual capabilities that some of the top performers do in terms of how they work with others and why they became top performers in that. And that is, loosely speaking, sort of a model for universal leadership. And I got to be really careful because I don't want to make it something that it really isn't. It's sort of a set of high-level platitudes, but it deals with people being what I call the 5 ambassadors. One is their great brand ambassadors. Second is their great imagination ambassadors. The third is their really good knowledge ambassadors. The fourth is their great relationship ambassadors. And the fifth is their great experience ambassadors. And I can send you information on this, but that is as close as you can get to having sort of a leadership model that might work, but it has to be tuned to every single culture. I'm not sure if I answered your question because I realized I probably went all over the map on that, but I wanted to see if that helps.
No, I think you did, especially the last part about the ambassadorship. I think that is probably quite universal. Perhaps the degree probably is different between different cultures, but I think all the 5 elements that you mentioned, they do play a part. So yeah, that was quite helpful. Thanks, John.
Yeah, you know, when it's fascinating about that too, because we all know what it's like to be around people who have a set of qualities that we look up to, we admire. I mean, there's so many people I look at right now in my life that I just wish I could be like, right? And yet you pull in some of those qualities for yourself that you think, well, this is something I could learn from. And what was interesting about the 5 ambassadors research is that was very much attuned to the relationship ambassador, which is this recognition that the really top performers were people who understood that any potential relationship was a long-term potential. It was not transactional. They didn't approach it from a very self-centered need. They approached it from this really could be something important to my career, my personal life, but the notion of relationship had deep resonant meaning for them.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
So thank you. Does that answer your question, Stuart?
Yes, to a great extent.
Now, yeah. Rick has been typing away. Rick Yanovich. Rick Yanovich is the founder and CEO of TRG International. He wrote 2 questions and then combined them. Rick, do you want to ask John the question directly?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Victor. And thanks very much, John, for your presentation. It's really good. Now, you mention that, and you have this discourse with Bob, that these soft skills are really important. Mm-hmm. And so 2 parts to the question. Number 1 is, as part of the Duke Shift research, how much of that is linked to these soft skills? Because when I read the summary at the end, it's very, very high level, and it's not talking about any of the touchy-feely stuff, but that it may be in there. That's one part. And linked to that is recently this week I had the pleasure of being coached by John Mattone, which, as you know, is one of the top coaches in the world, and his view on the problems with leadership these days is that not enough leaders display any vulnerability or heart, which is also linked to this touchy-feely soft skills. So has your research uncovered anything about that? And what are your own personal opinions, irrespective of the research? Thanks, John.
Yeah, so the first part of your question is most of the work we do is around the soft skills worldwide. We won't get hired to go teach an accounting course. Not that there's anything wrong with accounting, it's just not our bailiwick. It's not what we do. And I would consider that a hard skill, right? I mean, just to be very black and white about it. And so then you get into, I think to build on that, you start to get into the nuance of what does it mean to help people, leaders, emerging leaders, junior people in an organization, develop those soft skills. And it gets into behavioral routines, behavioral traits, where you're really trying to get people to almost be exposed to the way they have always done things in order for them to recognize what those things they've always done might be obstacles toward doing things better in the future, right? And that's very much a soft skill behavioral thing that is very hard for a business school to teach, but I don't think it removes them from the responsibility of trying to do it better. And so in our case, we focus 95% of our work worldwide around this broad spectrum of soft skills around leadership, behavior change, and almost everything in between. And I lost the thread. What was the second part of your question? I'm so sorry.
John Matone's comment that one of the problems with leadership, or the big leadership gap, is their lack of displaying either vulnerability or heart.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my goodness. It's to me, I think to me, that's probably the biggest disease in any organization. One of the things that we found that if you look at organizations that do internal engagement surveys, which is a measure of employee health, right, and whether or not they feel appreciated and whether their work matters and whatnot, there's been a really alarming sort of aggregate change over the last 5 or 6 years, and this is true almost everywhere in the world, with some odd pockets like Silicon Valley has some things that for some reason people enjoy the intellectual beating up that they get all the time. But what was interesting about it is when you look at what's driving that behavior is you've got a couple of key pieces where oops, did I lose it here?
No, you're still there. Looks like we've lost John. Okay. Hopefully he'll come back and join us shortly.
Okay, so Victor,
It's
you're going to
after
have
midnight.
to entertain us. You know, so what song are you going to sing?
Okay. Did everyone get the white paper, by the way, the shift white paper? While waiting for John to rejoin us. Did everyone get it this morning?
Yeah, I got it this morning, a great read.
Fantastic. Well, I read it a year and a half ago, and I read through it very quickly again today, this morning, or the soft copy on my laptop, and it's definitely worth reading. And by the way, for free to, I just got a note there that Kevin did not get it. Maybe we can make sure you do, but feel free to share it with whoever you want. Yes.
I'm
Welcome back, John. Welcome back,
you're
John.
back. Yay.
Great. Okay.
All right. So vulnerability. What's interesting about it is part of it is people are afraid to admit weakness, right? They're afraid to admit failure, which is just one dimension, vulnerability. And yet there's so much evidence that shows that when somebody is vulnerable, it actually changes the dynamic in an organization almost invariably for the better. Why? Because it gives permission and license for people to step out of their narrow straitjackets and confinements in order to test out new bold ideas. And I'll give you an example of how we've done this before in organizations. We've done some things there. We did a couple of things with a couple of companies in Thailand where they were dealing with these issues of people not being, in effect, authentic and vulnerable, to your point. And we went to their CEOs and actually wrote case studies on them and said, we need periods of time in your own careers where you had a real challenge and you had to overcome some major catastrophe or whatever it might have been, and you failed. And we want to write about that. and then we're gonna discuss it in session. But what we did is we took those case studies and we disguised the person, and we disguised it enough so it looked like it was somebody else, some other organization, and set it up in a way so that when we had the class discussion around this actual company CEO's failure, partway through the conversation, the CEO walked in. We planned this. The CEO walked in and said, "Hey, I know something about this situation." Got up in front of the room and revealed that it was actually him who had gone through this. And what was interesting about that little setup there and that little dynamic is the whole room of people who were struggling with this whole idea of how to be vulnerable suddenly had an actual situation, their CEO that they thought, was this perfect human, get up in front of the room and sat down with them. They circled chairs around them for the next 2 hours. They just had this open conversation around this person's particular failure that the case highlighted. The point behind it is that it is really hard for people to admit failure. It's particularly hard in that part of the world, in Southeast Asia. But no one wants to be able to say that they did something poorly. But the evidence is overwhelming. We know that we learn a lot from that. It's not to say go out and celebrate failure all the time and purposely try to screw things up. But the world would be a really dull place if everybody were perfect 4.0s from MIT. It would just be a dull place. We need no insult to MIT grads. But it's really about vulnerability, demonstrating to others that, like I mentioned earlier, businesses are social institutions, and people will be much more generous with their time, their intellectual effort, and their desire to contribute if they feel like that's paid back to them through psychological safety, through vulnerability exposure. Rick, it was a long answer to your question, and I even lost power in the process. Did that help?
Yes, it did. It really corroborated what John Mattone was saying. And funnily enough, you picked up on many elements of another person who joined the session, which is Dr. Marcia Reynolds, who's one of the leading lights on culture, and I believe it also resonates with the feelings of Marshall Goldsmith as well, who's yet another one of the coaching gurus. So basically, what you've just repeated or reiterated what current thinking is. Okay. There was one comment that you made that I'd like to pick up on you. You said it is hard for business schools like Duke to teach soft skills. Why is that?
I think it's partly because it's.
Anh nghĩ bởi chiều ngày mai em đẩy sớm xuống 3 giờ họp được.
What was that?
That was not me.
I don't know what that was. So, I think part of it is there's a global. We're all part of a global psychological myth, and that psychological myth is that you go to business school to learn how to be a billionaire or a very successful business person. And the only way to really do that is through certain hard skill capabilities. There's no question that that's important, but I think because of that, and because of the nature of the imprecision around research on the soft side of things, and knowing that behavior change isn't something you can learn in the course of a first-year MBA program or second year, if it's a 2-year program. But that behavior change takes place over multiple years. And anybody who's ever tried to quit smoking will know that. But it's just a very difficult thing for business schools to get their arms around in a comfortable way that enables tenure track faculty to get published in the right journals so they get promoted. So you tend to get biased towards the other areas where the disciplines are more obviously scientifically based or classically scientifically based. By positioning it that way, it makes it sound like they are less rigorous sciences, and that is not the case. Now, I will say that Duke, Harvard's dean, Stanford's new dean has been really good. INSEAD's got a great new dean. A few of them are really kind of, and you'd expect them to, but they're really leading the charge and starting to look at business as a force for good and as a institution, a global aggregated institution worldwide that should represent decency and so on. And that's beginning to work its way into business school curricula, but it's still a long ways off.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Rick, does that help you with your thinking? Are you in agreement with that, or what's your thinking there, Rick?
Absolutely perfect. Yes, spot on. Thanks very much, John.
Excellent. And I see some comments there regarding soft skills, but I'm going to go now to Tai Tong. He doesn't want to say the question out directly because it's very late in Texas where he is right now. He's based in Vietnam. He runs a business here, but he's actually in Texas right now. He's the CEO of Data Group. So I would imagine that it's probably, I'm not sure the time zone in Texas, but he'd like me to read the question out. He's typed it in the chat. Let me just have a look here to everyone. Hi, John. It's a pleasure listening to you. What do you think about the future of KPI practices in the workplace? How should we apply and balance it in an emotional, nurturing environment? Because KPI seems like a big contradiction towards values like human interaction, real motivation, empathy. Thanks. What's your response to that, John?
Well, he answered the question himself. Listen. I'm probably an overly biased proponent against rigorous KPI performance management. I believe KPIs are important. I do not think they should be the bellwether for somebody's career success or failure, because KPIs are, it'd be one thing if you could literally tie somebody's performance to a specific set of activities that was not influenced by a whole range of other variables, but that's not the case. And the key to KPIs is it can often produce toxic, counterproductive behavior. Not all the time. So I'm not saying get rid of KPIs, but I agree with the premise that it can be contradictory to the idea of a more empathetic organization, or an organization in which people feel like their psychological safety. And the reason why is it has the potential to drive perverse incentives. And those perverse incentives can be toward, well, if I've got to hit this number and I've got this time frame to get it in by, and there's only so many ways I can do this, and I know I can't depend on all these other people because they've got their own KPIs, and I'm just going to charge my way through it, come hell or high water, forgive my language, even if it means stepping on the toes of other people, because I've got to meet my number. And the moment that starts to happen is you start to get organizations that are no longer collaborative, but instead they're sort of mildly toxic. And that's where I think a KPI-driven approach by itself is dangerous. In fact, it's proven too, back to my point earlier on organizations where engagement scores are showing up in really strange ways. There are some really good examples of organizations where financial performance is literally growing beautifully, 10, 12, 15, 20% a year if you're a classic industry, 50, 60, 70% if it's high tech. And engagement scores are plummeting because of the KPIs, because people feel like they are being measured under so many different ways. It's a taxing burden that they can no longer actually execute the way they would love to be able to execute because they're constrained by the KPI straitjacket. So I don't know if I'd answer your question, agreed with you. I know I agreed with most of what your premise was, but I do think that you've got to really balance KPIs. I'm not against them, but I'm not.
Okay, so I'm going to reply from Tai Tong. Thanks, Victor. There's a baby in the house, so couldn't talk. So there you go. Thank you very much for that, John. If you've got any more questions, anybody, please feel free to type them or ask them. I'd like to go to Anup now. Anup is the General Director. He's been in Vietnam, I think, more than 10 years now. He is the Managing Director or General Director of Kirby Southeast Asia. Anup, do you want to ask your question to John directly? Anup, can you hear me?
Hi, John. How are you?
Hello.
Okay. So my question is again something very similar to Shoaib's question, where he talks about the culture. Now, the culture in Vietnam in particular and Southeast Asia in general is kind of a very relaxed way of working.
Mm-hmm.
Ownership is missing. The trust is a big question. And speed is a big issue. So with this, how do you find a fit with the rest of the world in terms of the leadership requirements? Because as you said, you have these 5 requirements, and I see all these 5 requirements are under question in Vietnam and in other regions, because I had the uh, fortune of working in all the regions, all the
Yeah.
countries in Southeast Asia. And I find the similar kind of a drag. People are not very keen to do as much as they are capable of. But one good thing is that they can repeat the process. Once they are told something, they can do. But
Yeah.
thinking out of the box or the critical thinking is a big question mark here. So how
Yeah.
do we modify our leadership style to get the maximum out of this situation and get the best possible results? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and you're right. I mean, I noticed that too as well in working across Southeast Asia, and it does vary by country, but there's that sense that the sense of ownership that you mentioned at the beginning, the sense of wanting to take innovative risks, is at a different level than maybe is what you would prefer. Some of that is certainly from my standpoint. When I first moved into Southeast Asia, coming from the U.S., I had a very different lens on what I thought companies ought to be like, and I learned painfully that that my worldview was not the right worldview, and I had to learn to adapt over time. And it took me about 15 years to kind of get comfortable with what it meant to work in different cultures and recognize that the larger generalizable traits that you're describing about being more accountable, taking greater ownership, taking risks, can still apply in different contexts, but you do have to, back to the earlier question on culture, you have to tune it to the needs of the culture. So back to an example again in Thailand, an organization there made a big pivot and is still making a big pivot there. And that pivot is away from being a 100-year-long manufacturing organization in an extraction industry toward an organization that's designed to be more test and learn, rapid prototyping, because they know that the world in which they've inhabited for so long is going to change in the next 10 years. And it's one thing to recognize that, it's another thing to actually get people to do things differently. So what they did is they chunked it down into tiny little incremental sub units for different business groups to say, let's just incrementally change routines a certain way. Let's just get ourselves more comfortable trying this. And they did it in the context of Thai culture. And it's not, if you're coming from a Western perspective, like I do, you may be very impatient for something like that. If you come from a different perspective where it still is not as fast as you would like it, there may be greater tolerance for the pace, knowing that it's ultimately going to achieve the outcome. But the recognition that that people will come to that as long as you shed yourself of your own sort of biases in the process and sort of retune it towards the needs of that audience, you can still get change. It just may not be change that's going to be like you might see with some other global organizations until it becomes a critical mass. Now, the other piece to that, which I did see, and by the way, the same company rotated people in and out by design into different markets around the world. So they got exposed to different places where they themselves had to be exposed to different leadership styles from European, South American, and US contexts. They would come back after a couple of years rotation and they would be a changed person. And they would have a very different lens. They didn't lose their essential Thai behavior, but they did gain some of the impetus from other places. Now, not everybody has the luxury of the finances, the budget to be able to do that. So what's your analog to that? Are there ways that you can give people that kind of stretch assignment where they can be exposed to different ways of thinking? And it may be just diversifying the population of the teams that they're on, different experience levels, different seniority levels, even some of the subcultures in country. You know, some of that stuff helps. All that stuff helps.
Thanks, John. That means, I mean, the concept of the promised land, which is a Western thought process for a business, which is arranging the business with mission, vision, value, then processes, then audits, then non-conformances, and finally, we want to make money for the shareholder. That's a typical promised land as far as the Western business thought process is concerned. But I think now the time has come, as I have heard you, that we will need to have a shift in this, and we'll have to have not one promised land, but we'll have to have a couple of promised lands, like for some reason we have to really think in terms of making money for the organization, but also as the second promised land, we should think in terms of the welfare of the people around us. And as a third promised land, you have to think about the work-life balance in your own personal life. So you have to think completely differently as a leader in the current context. And specifically after the pandemic, I find it much more relevant.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very good, fair synopsis. And look at, there are probably more variations on how companies are run in Southeast Asia than any place else in the world, which I thought was really kind of electrifying and fun for a lot of reasons. I mean, so, you know, even with this sort of Western perspective that we're kind of talking about in terms of how organizations are doing things, I will say that the findings from the stuff that we talked about earlier came predominantly from Asia, from Asian-based leaders, and that was interesting. And part of it came from organizations where, like in Malaysia, for example, where there are a lot of family-owned businesses that have been around for generations. They've grown a very different business model, and it's a very successful business model, and they've engendered a sense of sort of collegial family-like atmosphere because of the families that run the business. And they are engendering their own approaches to innovation and accountability and ownership as well. So again, it doesn't have to have the Western spin on it. I would say that the notion that, you know, sort of the Western approach is quickly going to give way over the next couple of decades to a global approach, because I think that the era of Silicon Valley dominated thinking on innovation, for example, is rapidly giving way to pockets around the world where it's happening in much more interesting ways.
Thank you, John. Anup, does that answer your question?
Yes, yes, more or less. Thanks.
Excellent. Okay, Rick made a comment to you in the chat. If you get a time to have a look at that, he said, Anup, it needs a lot of coaching to help change behaviors, and prior to that, to uncover and create life purpose. So there you go. There you go.
Can I comment on that for a moment? Because that's a really good point that Rick raises there too. One of the things that, so I'll give you a bit of background on what we did. I know my answers have been long-winded, so I apologize to everybody. But I will tell you that part of the work that we do has changed a lot as well, where we used to design classic sort of leadership learning journeys that may be multiple modules over many months, you know, in different countries and whatever it might be, has increasingly given way to something that Rick is alluding to here, which is the time in classroom, time in session, time in experiential learning is all well and good, and it's important. It's just, it's not enough, because the moment somebody leaves a program is the moment they tend to revert to default behaviors and biases. And the way to make it stick over time, and Rick, again, this probably goes back to, again, as you mentioned with your comments earlier, it only really works if you give those people, those participants in those kinds of activities, coaching and mentoring that sustains itself for a period of time afterward. And that period of time is usually not a week or two, it's usually a year or two. And doesn't mean you have to meet every week, but it does mean you're trying to get people to recognize that what they learn in session is to be applied out of session and then guided by coaches to see what obstacles they run into, so they can gut check what's working, what's not working. And the coaches can give advice about how to test things out in a different way, in a different environment. And it will not happen overnight. It does happen over time. And I think that idea of applying a lot of coaching to it is probably going to be, in many ways, the secret sauce for the next 20 or 30 years. And look, it's one of the reasons why we're hearing so many of our organizations talk about mentoring and reverse mentoring and learning from the millennials, because wisdom isn't always contained in the eldest people. It's not that we don't have it, but we're not the only ones. You know, the wisdom comes from a lot of places. And if we avail ourselves, open our minds, growth mindset, learning perspective, we can actually go a long ways towards learning from those below us, those lateral to us, those who are imposed on us as coaches, and make the progress that we need to make. But coaching is huge.
Great, thank you for that. There you go. You type a question or comment, Rick, and you get some great insights. There you go. So I'd like to ask Ron. Ron is in Hanoi. Ron is a consultant, and he's also he facilitates and organizes a peer group in Hanoi. Welcome, Ron. He has a question for you. Do you want to ask John the question directly? By the way, he's from Canada and he's been in Vietnam nearly a year now. Ron, can you hear us? Could you ask John the question? Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes.
can. Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, John, mostly I'm from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and and I wanted to start by giving Duke some props. I did some facilitation for your early stage introduction of your MBAs out in Chapel Hill, where the orientation, which was we were talking about, was how to emphasize human systems optimization and start thinking about that from the very beginning. And I think your guys at Duke did a good job at trying to kick it off. It's, you know, it's tough to integrate it into the institution, but this was going back 10 years ago when I did like 3 or 4 years there where we kicked it off in a ropes course out in triangle training out in the middle of nowhere.
Oh, fun.
It was really, anyway, good stuff on your part. I'll second, thank you for your fun today. This was good conversation. I appreciate what you bring to the table there. So, and lastly, which is more my academic side of it, I'm a behavioral science guy. I came out of CCL, Jim Farr, you know, that whole thing, that whole place over there in North Carolina. Talking about the integration of human systems optimization measurements into the institution, which is, I'm sorry if I'm just being jargony, but it's like, you know, we've got to find a way to measure these soft skill performances that we're asking people to deliver. And so my thought was kind of like, where's your thoughts on it? You know, we can all have positions, but until we find a way to integrate it into the institution, measure it, and then reward or, you know, you get ahead because you're good at this soft stuff, not because you like it or because it's good or we recognize, but it's really around, it's an essential part of performance to be good at this human systems optimization. So enough said. I hope you're not in Santa Cruz or somewhere where it's burning.
I'm outside Portland, Oregon, where it's burning.
I thought he's in Northern California. I was.
No. I grew up in Northern California, but I'm near an area called Bend, Oregon, near Mount Bachelor.
Oh, I know it well. And I actually know that whole well. Did some stuff up there. Anyway.
Oh, okay. So it's a it's. I'm sorry. Did you finish your question?
Yep. I hope it was clearer than that.
Yeah, no, it is. It's very clear. So I think it's a really interesting point. So part of it begins with what I think some assumptions organizations have tended to make over time about what is measurable and what isn't measurable in a classic context of measurement, right? So I think one of the problems, and I'll get sort of what I think to me is one of the solutions. I don't have the magic answer, but I've got sort of some thoughts around it, and I'd love to hear what you think of that. Is oftentimes when sort of classic leadership training has taken place, there is still a mentality about, forgive the terminology, but it's measuring butts and seats, and it's just making sure there's, you know, did you get enough people trained and what did you learn, and you test them. And I know that's not quite the case, but you've got a lot of leaders around the world who kind of look at things that way, and they assume that knowledge is testable, and testable knowledge indicates progress. And if you didn't test well, you didn't learn a lot, and you should be out. But the behavior piece that you're driving at is I agree you can measure it, but I don't think it's a metric per se, because it's really hard to say, you know, I'm 3% better today than I was yesterday, and without putting some boundaries around what it is you're trying to look at. So the way we sort of look at it, at least the way I try to look at it, is what are the outcomes you're trying to achieve? And again, this won't be unfamiliar to you at all, but you know, what are the outcomes you're trying to achieve? So if it's, you want to be a more innovative leader, well, there's a lot of things to be more innovative. I mean, are you creating psychological safety? Are you giving permission to your team to contribute ideas without shutting them down before the ideas come out of their mouth? Are you allowing people to fail within reason? Are you doing, you know, the creating the environment where these kinds of activities can start to pick up speed? And then it becomes more like a dial, right? So you can almost do like a level 3 Kirkpatrick kind of thing, where what was the leader's behavior like before they started practicing some new behaviors? What was it like 6 months later, 12 months later? And did you notice an improvement? And did the leader themselves, or the subject themselves, gain some traction and improvement along the way too? I get very concerned, and I remember this is years ago, I was teaching a class in Singapore to the EDB, the Economic Development Board, And at that time, I was teaching stuff about marketing, but I was talking about some of the more abstract notions of marketing, and talking about emotional reactions to things. And one of the participants said, "Emotion doesn't mean anything to me. I mean, if I can't measure it, it's not worth anything." And I was being a bit cheeky, and I had to say at the time, I said, "Are you married?" And he said, "I'm married." And I said, "So what's the return on investment on your marriage?" And I knew I was getting into some deep water when I said that, but I just, my mouth ran off with me. And he said, "Well, I never really thought about it that way." And I said, "Well, do you love your spouse, 80% more than before, 50% less?" But he said, "I don't know. I can't put a metric to that." And I said, "Well, that's the point. Some of this stuff is a bit more about sort of behavioral appreciation, but setting targets about the outcomes you're trying to achieve, and getting 360s and level 3 evaluations to kind of help see how people are doing in progress." Long rambling answer.
No, cool. Good stuff. Yeah, I mean, I could go on about this for hours. I don't want to take up all the time. I'm very interested. I mean, obviously, to me, we start with beliefs, attitudes, values, and maybe some kind of a measurement system around, I mean, fundamentally, ethics got to start with a set of agreements, which I would define as opposed to values, which are reinforced by guilt. So from an ethical system, from an ethical system, where do we start by establishing a codification? It seems to me from there, at least we can begin to build on how do we create the things that we want to measure. I mean, but it's got to be founded in beliefs, values, attitudes, stuff.
Well, and I'll tell you, you're not alone in wanting to pursue this. I mean, we're trying to figure out ways around this. So we should talk more. It is, to me, it's sort of the, forgive the metaphor, but it's kind of the holy grail, right? If we can solve this in some way, it will go a long way towards helping organizations, right? Kind of see how their leaders are moving along. I know there's some interesting stuff taking place in AI where you can take somebody's, well, actually, let me ask you a question. This is for all of you too. Any of you heard about the research out of Stanford called Axis Flip, AXISFLIP? Axis Flip is a thought experiment that's taking place at Stanford. But the bottom line is they basically said what universities need to do and what businesses, in fact, society needs to do is to stop looking at knowledge-based kinds of assets and start looking towards what they call skill prints. And skill prints are a collection of different capabilities that we build and we begin in institutions like universities. But those skill prints become our unique sort of personal capability DNA that will grow and shrink depending on where we are in our career, and we'll add to it, we'll subtract from it, but those skill prints become sort of the drivers of how we do things. And I know it's a bit esoteric to talk about it. Take a look at Axis Flip from Stanford and read about it. It's really fascinating stuff. But I think the idea of skill print kind of goes to what you're describing there too. And by the way, I love the fact that you're from Canada, because depending on what happens on Tuesday, I may move to Canada.
Yeah, I've had several requests recently.
Okay.
I'm already out of the country, and the question is, can I ever get back?
Okay, so I see some comments here from Bob Colony. I appreciate the long answers, and Shub responded absolutely. So they love your insights, John. We have Kyle here. He has a great anecdote about Singapore executive asking him to measure the ROI on his marriage. Okay, okay. So I'm not sure. Are you referring to what John just said, Kyle?
Sounds like it.
Okay, okay. Actually, John is actually based now in the United States. He oversees Southeast Asia with Duke Corporate Education and also North America. So, but he did live in Singapore for 15 years. Okay. Ty, who's actually in Texas right now, says he agrees with Rick's answer to Anup, and I see the same way with him. We need plenty of coaching sessions, corrections in order to run a business in Vietnam. It's not mature yet. Okay, so excellent. So we're open
Victor,
up for
can I comment on something? Can I comment on something?
Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry
Yes.
about this. And so it's just, I'm looking in the chat here too, which I'm finally kind of focusing in on here. So forgive me. but I see, Victor raised the question about the S curves. Are we familiar with the concept of the S curves? And the short answer is, yeah, we do work on that space a little bit too. We term it successive approximation. That's not just exclusive to us, but it's the notion that, just as you're going up that curve and it's either about to descend into disinvestment or going out of business, you start to work on the next curve, right? Is that what you're sort of referring to, Victor?
Well, actually, I was reading the comment. It wasn't my comment.
That was my comment, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's basically trying to, can you predict it? Can you jump it? Because usually by the time that initiative is failing, it's too late.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that's why you do multiple ones, right? Because no matter what, you've got to have something going all the time. It's all the irons in the fire, which is one of the reasons why the idea of design thinking as being a way to solve a problem is not necessarily the right way to apply it, because it can be used to energize an organization to perpetually generate a series of S curves that you can pursue. It doesn't mean you're going off into all kinds of wild adjacencies, but it does mean you have opportunities that you're probably not focusing on, because you get that escalation to commitment where you get so sunk into something that you can't unwind yourself from it before you are in the decline, and then it's too late. But yeah, it's interesting. There's what I'll do is, Victor, remind me, I'll send out another report. It's a few years old that we did, and it deals with this idea of successive approximation. And Rick, if you can find a way to predict exactly when to make that happen, I think it goes back to the other question. If we can just find that way to solve how to evaluate soft skills perfectly, both of those things together, we will take over the planet.
Well, I'm looking forward to receiving that paper that is a white paper, or is it a research paper?
It's from like 2013 that we did. It's even before I joined DE.
So please send it to me. We'll send that out with the recording of today's session and the shift paper. By the way, if any of you still want that shift paper, it's in the chat. You can download it right here, right now. So we've got time for a few more questions. Anybody else want to ask John some questions? It's approaching 1 o'clock in the morning in the United States. It's approaching 3 o'clock here in Vietnam. Anybody would like to ask John a question? There you go. Do you have anything? Yes, so go ahead, John.
I can comment on something. So Bob, you raised a question here about the HBR case on Zurich Insurance. I haven't read that case yet, but the 8 factors that they use to measure best managers, is the gist of that it was about, the sort of the clean separation between the KPI are part of that and how they show up as leaders in the organization? Is that how it works?
It was based off of a Google study in-house at Google. And
okay.
They found 8 factors that they said, our best managers have these skill sets. And then the questions on the annual engagement surveys pointed to those skill sets, like, is your manager coaching you? Some of that kind of stuff. And they basically started saying these 8 oxygen factors is what we are going to be measuring every year, and we want to see growth every year. And they, I liked it because they said, it's not just KPIs, it's looking at these, but the case also layers how you introduce this big change of culture. There's a 1-day kickoff for every manager, 10,000 managers, and then new employees get 3 or 4 days of training in these ideas. And then there's training on training and coaching, and they developed an online corporate university to get it to be a learning culture. But they went from, their starting point was 40% of their managers didn't want to be managers. So how do you entice them to be better at leading the sales force? And so it was interesting from that point. It was also interesting that Google had their 8 factors, but before this company did theirs, they did a preliminary study to find their own 8 factors, which may have been somewhat the same, but somewhat different from Google's. So it was an interesting case.
That's great. I'm going to read that. I've written it down here. So I love that. I wanted to see that. Thank you.
Thank you for that
There's a
comment
verbal
there.
question it says here from Kyle.
Yes. Go
Hi,
ahead,
Sorry,
Kyle.
I took over your role.
I just want to share what we've done with our group here in Vietnam. We asked them to actually contribute and design our own soft skills. We created an acronym called COSMIC: customer care, our people, success, managing excellence, integrity, and communication. And that was everyone participating, and then we designed it. And I used a lot of past resources to build on that. But I started off by actually sharing golden nuggets of wisdom. What I would say, this is what my dad taught me, and this is what a lot of my mentors of the past, who are all dead now, they're like, when I started work, this is when I was lucky enough to go and talk to the guys who are 50 and 60 years old, the men and women, and they shared with me their thoughts and their wisdom. And I was wise enough to actually document a lot of this. And we start with that as a soft skill, to learn what others have done successfully in the past, to pass it down. And then we design together this cosmic soft skills program of customer care and our people, success, managing excellence, integrity, and communication. And we did it just out of necessity. We would love to have had the science behind it, without a doubt. But we've just created it without any science behind it, by just being practical.
Yeah, it's being practical is a good thing.
I mean, we love the science behind it. Without a doubt, I'm an MBA, and I try and pass down what I've been taught to others, but sometimes it's just referring back to, especially in Vietnam with the culture here, we have to say, well, what did your grandparents share with you? Yeah. That's what we need to bring into the workplace.
It's interesting that you mentioned it. It's triggered a thought. There's an organization. It's actually in Baja, Mexico. It's called the Modern Elder Academy, MEA, and it's a school of wisdom. Now, before you go running out thinking I'm really feeding you all kinds of crazy nonsense here, it's actually pretty interesting. It was founded. I'll reveal the whole thing. So it was founded by a guy who was one of my college roommates. And he went off and he started a company called Joie de Vivre Hotels in North America that became the second largest boutique hotelier. He sold it, and then he worked with Brian Chesney at Airbnb. And then about 4 years ago, he started this Modern Elder Academy. Why? Well, he felt like the way you look at life, the stages that we've all historically looked at life, which is sort of youth, adolescence, and adulthood, are the wrong stages, because our lifespans are longer and so on, and we can't put people out to pasture and retire at age 65 or whatever it might be, because people have a lot to contribute well past that. So he started this Modern Elder Academy, which has become this wisdom school. And yes, it sounds a little odd, but it actually has some fairly interesting curricula to it. To your point on just how the insights you can get from different generations are valuable no matter what, right? And the fact that you could be 65 years old and starting a career over and starting a company for the first time, or becoming a teacher, or whatever it might be, that's great. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to retire, right? And it's a very interesting piece that looks at the longevity issues in life, and how people have to kind of rethink what they do post natural retirement age as we've defined it. That was...
John, on the soft skills, we look at, for example, customer care, and we said, who was the customer? And we've had to go to that level of their internal customers, their external customers. And then when we talk about communication, we talk about the science of the words are only approximately 7%, and that it is our tonal voice and our body language that is the majority of what we're actually communicating.
Yeah.
And we go through exercises with the team. We're only a small team of 100 and growing, and we actually pass it down. And because these guys are starved. They didn't learn it at university.
Yeah.
They didn't learn it on the job at previous employers. Yet our customers expect something better than what they're getting. They want them to do it with a bit of understanding and care. So we have to teach that, and we have to give examples. And so I end up researching very quickly to find out different examples, and we pass that down. But it comes back to a lot of the nuggets of wisdom that they've never been taught.
Well, and what I love about that, and again about the Modern Elder Academy too, is it goes back to sort of the millennial old art of storytelling, right? So storytelling is actually a very powerful device for engendering social fabric, whether it's a company or otherwise. And how we gain that institutional knowledge is rarely book based. It's often like you have done in your organization with Cosmic. It's a terrific device. And you know, not enough companies pay attention to that, because I'm just guessing that not enough companies pay attention to that kind of approach because they probably think that it doesn't feel businessy enough. But the reality of it is we spend more of our lives in business than we do with our families.
Could you
Probably.
mute?
And we might as well make them enriching. And we might as well tell the stories that'll help others, make it enriching for the next generation.
Thank you, Kyle, for your comment. Thank you, John. We have time for a couple more questions. I know Shub has sent me a message, and he's got a question now. Shub, ask your question, please. Go ahead.
Victor, you put me in a spot there.
Oh,
Question has
okay.
nothing to do with business.
Oh,
Because
okay.
it is a simple one. Who's going to win?
Oh, okay. Oh, I see. The election. Oh, see, I misunderstood. You sent me a private message. Haha, who's going to win? I think that was a comment about you might move into Canada depending on what happens next week. I see. Okay. Oh, okay. Right. Okay. I misread that. Okay. I'm sorry about that, Shub.
So who do you think is going to win? I'll ask you that question. Who do you think is going to win?
Well, I have my preferences, but it doesn't really matter. It's what the Americans choose, right? Yeah.
Okay, I misread that. I thought you actually had a question. Okay, you made a comment. Okay, time for one more question, John. Thanks a lot. You've really, it's been an inspiring discussion here. Lots of input, lots of interaction between our participants, all the members here in Vietnam. Time for one more question. Who'd like to ask it?
I'll ask it then. If you had to give, John, if you had to give some advice going into the most important meeting of your career, and you just gave some advice to, say, a younger person, what would that be? For example, I say, look them in the eye and shake their hand firmly and smile. And that's that type of little advice, soft skills advice is never taught properly. So what would you tell a younger person going into that type of meeting on how to be professional representing the organization?
Oh, I love this. Yeah, I love this question. So thank you for that. And I agree with your answer there. And I would just add one more thing to that. And that is, I would actually, it sounds simple, but I would say to that person, prepare. And what I mean by that is, you know, just know who that audience is going to be. Try to know as much as you can. Do your homework so that you have at least some sense of anticipation. I mean, one of the things that's been interesting, anticipation about what they might ask. But one of the things that's been interesting, and I know you all see this in the work that you do too. The most successful teams tend to be successful, and the people within that, whether it's junior or senior people, tend to do that because they do a lot of role play, and that role play invites, you know, people to poke holes in each other's analyses and ways they're approaching things, and that goes into preparation. And I don't think enough of that gets done. And that's this goes back to business schools. I think business schools could do more of this to prepare people to come out of business school so they don't have to hit companies with basically no people training. They can actually hit the ground running and be much more effective leaders earlier on. But back to the point of just a junior person, prepare. And you're right. Look them in the eye. Now, the other thing is what you described was a very Western kind of approach. And it's not necessarily going to be successful in all cultures. So it would depend on the culture, but I think the sentiment is correct.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Time
Does
for
that-
one more question?
Go ahead, Mark. Fire away.
Hey, John, fascinating stuff. Thank you. What is a must read for you? Is anything you've read lately that you want to share with us here on the topic today? And I'll tell you who's going to win the election, by the way.
Oh, cool. Cool. Well, actually, I'll show you something I'm reading right now. So this is a book by Rebecca Henderson. She's a Harvard professor. It's called Reimagining Capitalism. And it's fascinating, partly, and it's about how business can save the world. All of us are on various missions. I'm on a mission I feel like business has a real role to play to be a force for good, not just a maker of goods. And her research is fascinating. So I encourage you to read that. On fiction, I have to share one fiction if that's okay. I love historical novels, but in particular Ken Follett out of the UK, and he wrote a book back in 1989, which is still my all-time favorite, and it is called Pillars of the Earth. And if you haven't read it, it's fantastic. But I love English history, and that's see, Bob likes it. And he's written 3 other books since then. His newest one just came out in this whole series. It's really, really good. Now, to the election. What's your guess?
Okay. Yeah, let me embarrass myself, okay? I'm one of those idiots that went against the institution, against the establishment, and I voted for Trump. Let me tell you, I won't do it again. The guy is a complete idiot, and Biden's going to win by a landslide. Sorry about that. It's going to happen. You won't have to move to Canada. Don't worry about it. You'll stay where you are. You're okay.
Oh man, I think you're right. By the way, everything you said is correct, except that I did not vote for Trump the first time around. And I should probably never talk about politics, but I will tell you that I was in Malaysia 4 years ago at this time, and I was teaching in a program, and I was with a colleague, and it was Wednesday morning. Basically it was nighttime still in the U.S. The results had not come in, and all the participants were saying, "Who do you think is going to win?" And I said, "Hillary's going to win. It's close, but Hillary's going to win." And a couple hours into the session, all the mobile phones came out. They're all looking at their phones, and one guy raised his hand. He said, "Hey, John." I said, "What?" He said, "Trump won." And I went, "What?" There's no way. And he said, "We're not kidding." And they all showed their phones, which meant they weren't even paying attention. They were reading the results. And I could not believe it. So there you go. Yeah, I think Biden's going to win.
Buy gold. The U.S. dollar is going to take a hit. Thanks. See you later, buddy.
Okay. Well, on that note, we'll see you very soon. John, on behalf of us here in Vietnam and those that tuned in from around the globe, Australia and the US, thank you so much. We really appreciate the relationship we have with Duke Corporate Education. I know it's approaching 1 o'clock in the morning, or just gone 1 o'clock in the morning where you are, but thanks again. I'm sure I echo the thoughts of everyone here. We really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Victor, and everyone. I love the questions, and thanks for bearing with my long-winded answers. But honestly, please reach out to me. If you've got more stuff you want to share, ideas you want to share, I'm there. Oh, can I mention one thing, Victor? One quick thing?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
There is a freebie for all of you. This sounds like a car salesman. It's not meant to. November 19th, we are doing a global conference. It's a 2-hour conference called the Davos of Human Capital. It's the 3rd time we've done this. But we've got Dan Ariely, who is a Fuqua professor, behavioral economist, that many of you may know. We've got a number of CEOs from around the world. It's a 2-hour conference only, so it's going to be very fast-paced. It's virtual. And I can tell you the times. It will be 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Singapore time. So I think will that be 8 to 10?
It'll be 8 till 10. That's correct. 8 till 10 p.m. here in Vietnam.
Yeah. So Victor, I'll make sure we send you that. It's free, and we'd love it if you'd all register because it'll be interesting. And we'll have some great speakers there. It's going to be very fast paced, and the theme of it is about leadership for a better world. So November 19th, mark it on your calendars. Victor, I'll send it out to you separately.
Please do. And that paper that you mentioned as well we'll send that out and the link to the recording. Thank you, everybody. That concludes today's session. Thank you again to you, John. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Great talking.
Okay.
Enjoyed it.
Prepare for the coup.